The Black Stranger by Robert E. Howard. Part 2. Chapter 5. A Man from the Wilderness. The storm had spent its fury. Full dawn rose in a clear blue rain-washed sky. As the sun rose in a blaze of fresh gold, bright-hued birds lifted a swelling chorus from the trees on whose broad leaves beads of water sparkled like diamonds, quivering in the gentle morning breeze. At a small stream which wound over the sands to join the sea, hidden beyond a fringe of trees and bushes, a man bent to lave his hands and face. He performed his ablutions after the manner of his race, grunting lustily and splashing like a buffalo. But in the midst of these splashing, he lifted his head suddenly, his tawny hair dripping and water running in rivulets over his brawny shoulders. He crouched in a listening attitude for a split second. Then he was on his feet and facing inland, sword in hand, all in one motion. And there he froze, glaring wide-mouthed. A man as big as himself was striding toward him over the sands, making no attempt at stealth, and the pirate's eyes widened as he stared at the close-fitting silk breeches, high flaring-topped boots, wide-skirted coat and headgear of 100 years ago. There was a broad cutlass in the stranger's hand and unmistakable purpose in his approach. The pirate went pale as recognition blazed in his eyes. "You!" he ejaculated unbelievingly. "By Mitra, you!" Oaths streamed from his lips as he heaved up his cutlass. The birds rose in flaming showers from the trees as the clang of steel interrupted their song. Blue sparks flew from the hacking blades, and the sand grated and ground under the stumping boot heels. Then the clash of steel ended in a chopping crunch, and one man went to his knees with a choking gasp. The hilt escaped his nerveless hand, and he slid full length on the sand which reddened with his blood. With a dying effort he fumbled at his girdle and drew something from it, trying to lift it to his mouth, and then stiffened convulsively and went limp. The conqueror bent and ruthlessly tore the stiffening fingers from the object they crumpled in their desperate grasp. Zarono and Valenzo stood on the beach, staring at the driftwood their men were gathering. Spars, pieces of mast, broken timbers. So savagely had the storm hammered Zaronos' ship against the low cliffs that most of the salvage was matchwood. A short distance behind them stood Belessa, listening to their conversation, one arm about Tina. The girl was pale and listless, apathetic to whatever fate held in store for her. She heard what the man said, but with little interest. She was crushed by the realization that she was but a pawn in the game, however it was to be played out. Whether it was to be a wretched life dragged out on that desolate coast, or a return, effected somehow, to some civilized land. Zarono cursed venomously, but Valenzo seemed dazed. "This is not the time of year for storms from the west," he muttered, staring with haggard eyes at the men dragging the wreckage up on the beach. "It was not chance that brought that storm out of the deep to splinter the ship in which I meant to escape." "Escape? I am caught like a rat in a trap, as it was meant. Nay, we are all trapped rats." "I don't know what you're talking about," snarled Zarono, giving a vicious yank at his mustache. "I've been unable to get any sense out of you since that flaxen-haired slut upset you last night with her wild tale of black men coming out of the sea. But I do know that I'm not going to spend my life on this cursed coast. 10 of my men went to hell in the ship, but I've got 160 more. You've got 100. There are tools in your fort and plenty of trees in yonder forest. We'll build a ship. I'll set men to cutting down trees as soon as they get this drift dragged up out of the reach of the waves." "It will take months," muttered Valenzo. "Well, is there any better way in which we could employ our time? We are here, and unless we build a ship, we'll never get away. We'll have to rig up some kind of a sawmill, but I've never encountered anything yet that balked me long. I hope that storm smashed Strom to bits, the Argosian dog. While we are building the ship, we'll hunt for old Tranicos' loot." "We will never complete your ship," said Valenzo somberly. "You fear the Picts? We have enough men to defy them." "I do not speak of Picts. I speak of a black man." Zarono turned on him angrily. "Will you talk sense? Who is this accursed black man?" "Accursed indeed," said Valenzo, staring seaward. "A shadow of my own red-stained past risen up to hound me to hell. Because of him I fled Zingara, hoping to lose my trail in the great ocean, but I should have known he would smell me out at last." "If such a man came ashore, he must be hiding in the woods," growled Zarono. "We'll rake the forest and hunt him out." Valenzo laughed harshly. "Seek for a shadow that drifts before a cloud that hides the moon. Grope in the dark for a cobra. Follow a mist that steals out of the swamp at midnight." Zarono cast him an uncertain look, obviously doubting his sanity. "Who is this man? Have done with ambiguity." "The shadow of my own mad cruelty and ambition. A horror came out of the lost ages, no man of mortal flesh and blood, but—" "Sail ho!" bowled the lookout on the north point. Zarono wheeled, and his voice slashed the wind. "Do you know her?" "Aye," the reply came back faintly. "It's the Red Hand." Zarono cursed like a wild man. "Strom, the devil takes care of his own. How could he ride out of that blow?" The buccaneer's voice rose to a yell that carried up and down the strand. "Back to the fort, you dogs!" Before the Red Hand, somewhat battered in appearance, nosed around the point, the beach was bare of human life, the palisade bristling with helmets and scarf-bound heads. The buccaneers accepted the alliance with the easy adaptability of adventurers, the henchmen with the apathy of serfs. Zarono ground his teeth as a longboat swung leisurely into the beach, and he sighted the tawny head of his rival in the bow. The boat grounded, and Strom strode toward the fort alone. Some distance away he halted and shouted in a bull's bellow that carried clearly in the still morning. "Ahoy, the fort! I want to parley!" "Well, why in hell don't you?" snarled Zarono. "The last time I approached under a flag of truce, an arrow broke on my breastplate," roared the pirate. "I want a promise it won't happen again." "You have my promise," called Zarono sardonically. "Damn your promise, you Zingaran dog. I want Valenzo's word." A measure of dignity remained to the Count. There was an edge of authority to his voice as he answered. "Advance, but keep your men back. You will not be fired upon." "That's enough for me," said Strom instantly. "Whatever Acorzetta's sins, once his word is given, you can trust him." He strode forward and halted under the gate, laughing at the hate-darkened visage Zarono thrust over at him. "Well, Zarono," he taunted, "you're a ship shorter than you were when I last saw ya. But you Zingarans never were sailors." "How did you save your ship, you Messentian gutter scum?" snarled the buccaneer. "There's a cove some miles to the north, protected by a high-ridged arm of land that broke the force of the gale," answered Strom. "I was anchored behind it. My anchors dragged, but they held me off the shore." Zarono scowled blackly. Valenzo said nothing. He had not known of that cove. He had done scant exploring of his domain. Fear of the Picts and lack of curiosity had kept him and his men near the fort. The Zingarans were by nature neither explorers nor colonists. "I came to make a trade," said Strom easily. "We've naught to trade with you save sword strokes," growled Zarono. "I think otherwise," grinned Strom thin-lipped.
You tipped your hand when you murdered Galacus, my first mate, and robbed him. Until this morning, I supposed that Valenso had Tranicos' treasure. But if either of you had it, you wouldn't have gone to the trouble of following me and killing my mate to get the map. The map?
Zarono ejaculated, stiffening.
Oh, don't dissemble,
laughed Strom, but anger blazed blue in his eyes.
I know you have it. Picts don't wear boots.
But, began the Count, nonplussed, but fell silent as Zarono nudged him.
And if we have the map, said Zarono, what have you to trade that we might require? Let me come into the fort, suggested Strom. There we can talk.
He was not so obvious as to glance at the men peering at them from along the wall, but his two listeners understood, and so did the men. Strom had a ship. That fact would figure in any bargaining or battle, but it would carry just so many, regardless of who commanded. Whoever sailed away in it, there would be some left behind. A wave of tense speculation ran along the silent throng at the palisade.
Your men will stay where they are,
warned Zarono, indicating both the boat drawn up on the beach and the ship anchored out in the bay.
Aye, but don't get the idea that you can seize me and hold me for a hostage.
He laughed grimly.
I want Velosus's word that I'll be allowed to leave the fort alive and unhurt within the hour, whether we come to terms or not. You have my pledge,
answered the Count.
All right then, open that gate and let's talk plainly.
The gate opened and closed, the leaders vanished from sight, and the common men of both parties resumed their silent surveillance of each other. The men on the palisade and the men squatting beside their boat, with a broad stretch of sand between. And beyond a strip of blue water, the carrack with steel caps glinting all along her rail. On the broad stair above the great hall, Bellessa and Tina crouched, ignored by the men below. These sat about the broad table, Valenso, Galbro, Zarono and Strom. But for them the hall was empty. Strom gulped the wine and set the empty goblet on the table. The frankness suggested by his bluff countenance was belied by the dancing lights of cruelty and treachery in his wide eyes. But he spoke bluntly enough.
We all want the treasure. Old Tranicos sits somewhere near this bay, he said abruptly. Each has something the others need. Valenso has laborers, supplies, and a stockade to shelter us from the Picts. You, Zarono, have my map. I have a ship. What I'd like to know, remarked Zarono, is this. If you've had the map all these years, why haven't you come after the loot sooner? I didn't have it. It was that dog Zingalito who knifed the old miser in the dark and stole the map. But he had neither ship nor crew, and it took him more than a year to get them. When he did come after the treasure, the Picts prevented his landing, and his men mutinied and made him sail back to Zingara. One of them stole the map from him, and recently sold it to me.
That was why Zingalito recognized the bay, muttered Valenso.
Did that dog lead you here, Count? I might have guessed it. Where is he?
Doubtless in hell, since he was once a buccaneer.
The Picts slew him, evidently while he was searching in the woods for the treasure. Good,
approved Strom heartily.
Well, I don't know how you knew my mate was carrying the map. I trusted him, and the men trusted him more than they did me, so I let him keep it. But this morning he wandered inland with some of the others, got separated from them, and we found him sworded to death near the beach, and the map gone. The men were ready to accuse me of killing him, but I showed the fools the tracks left by his slayer, and proved to them that my feet wouldn't fit them. And I knew it wasn't any one of the crew, because none of them wear boots that make that sort of track, and Picts don't wear boots at all, so it had to be a Zingaran. Well, you've got the map, but you haven't got the treasure. If you had it, you wouldn't have let me inside the stockade. I've got you penned up in this fort. You can't get out to look for the loot, and even if you did get it, you have no ship to get away in. Now, here's my proposal. Zarono, give me the map. And you, Valenzo, give me fresh meat and other supplies. My men are nigh to scurvy after the long voyage. In return, I'll take you 3 men, the Lady Bellessa and her girl, and set you ashore within reach of some Zingaran port. Or I'll put Zarono ashore near some buccaneer rendezvous if he prefers, since doubtless a noose awaits him in Zingara. And, to clinch the bargain, I'll give each of you a handsome share in the treasure.
The buccaneer tugged his mustache meditatively. He knew that Strom would not keep any such pact if made, nor did Zarono even consider agreeing to his proposal. But to refuse bluntly would be to force the issue into a clash of arms. He sought his agile brain for a plan to outwit the pirate. He wanted Strom's ship as avidly as he desired the lost treasure.
What's to prevent us from holding you captive and forcing your men to give us your ship in exchange for you?
He asked.
Strom laughed at him. Do you think I'm a fool? My men have orders to heave up the anchors and sail hence if I don't reappear within the hour, or if they suspect treachery. They wouldn't give you the ship if you skinned me alive on the beach. Besides, I have the Count's word. My pledge is not straw, said Valenzo somberly. Have done with threats, Zarono.
Zarono did not reply, his mind wholly absorbed in the problem of getting possessions of Strom's ship, of continuing the parley without betraying the fact that he did not have the map. He wondered who in Mithras's name did have the accursed map.
Let me take my men away with me on your ship when we sail, he said. I cannot desert my faithful followers.
Strom snorted.
Why don't you ask for my cutlass to slit my gullet with? Desert your faithful. Bah! You desert your brother to the devil if you could gain anything by it. No, you are not going to bring enough men aboard to give you a chance to mutiny and take my ship. Give us a day to think it over,
urged Zarono, fighting for time. Strom's heavy fist banged on the table, making the wine dance in the glasses.
No, by Mitra! Give me my answer now!
Zarono was on his feet, his black rage submerging his craftiness.
You Barachan dog, I'll give you your answer in your guts!
He tore aside his cloak, caught at his sword hilt. Strom heaved up with a roar, his chair crashing backward to the floor. Valenzo sprang up, spreading his arms between them as they faced one another across the board, jutting jaws close together, blades half drawn, faces convulsed.
Gentlemen, have done! Zarono, he has my pledge. A foul fiend gnaw your pledge,
snarled Zarono.
Stand from between us, my lord,
growled the pirate, his voice thick with the killing lust.
Your word was that I should not be treacherously treated. It shall be considered no violation of your pledge for this dog and me to cross swords in equal play.
Well spoken, Strom! It was a deep, powerful voice behind them, vibrant with grim amusement. All wheeled and glared open-mouthed. Up on the stair, Bellessa started up with an involuntary exclamation. A man strode out from the hangings that masked the chamber door and advanced toward the table without haste or hesitation. Instantly he dominated the group, and all felt the situation subtly charged with a new dynamic atmosphere. The stranger was as tall as either of the freebooters, and more powerfully built than either, yet for all his size he moved with pantherish suppleness in his high, flaring-topped boots. His thighs were cased in close-fitting breeches of white silk. His wide-skirted sky-blue coat opened to reveal an open-necked, white silken shirt beneath, and a scarlet sash that girdled his waist. There were silver acorn-shaped buttons on the coat, and it was adorned with gilt-worked cuffs and pocket flaps, and a satin collar. A lacquered hat completed a costume obsolete by nearly 100 years. A heavy cutlass hung at the wearer's hip.
Conan!
ejaculated both freebooters together, and Valenzo and Galbro caught their breath at that name.
Who else?
The giant strode up to the table, laughing sardonically at their amazement.
What do you do here?
Stuttered the seneschal.
How came you here, uninvited and unannounced?
I climbed the palisade on the east side while you fools were arguing at the gate,
Conan answered.
Every man in the fort was craning his neck westward. I entered the manor while Strom was being let in at the gate. I've been in that chamber there ever since, eavesdropping.
I thought you were dead, said Zorono slowly. 3 years ago, that shattered hull of your ship was sighted off a reefy coast, and you were heard of on the main no more.
I didn't drown with my crew,
answered Conan.
It'll take a bigger ocean than that one to drown me.
Up on the stair, Tina was clutching Bellessa in her excitement and staring through the balustrades with all her eyes.
Conan, my lady, 'tis Conan! Look, oh look!
Bellessa was looking. It was like encountering a legendary character in the flesh. Who of all the sea folk had not heard the wild, bloody tales told of Conan, the wild rover who had once been a captain of the Barachan pirates and one of the greatest scourges of the sea? A score of ballads celebrated his ferocious and audacious exploits. The man could not be ignored. Irresistibly, he had stalked into the scene to form another dominant element in the tangled plot. And in the midst of their frightened fascination, Bellessa's feminine instincts prompted a speculation as to Conan's attitude toward her. Would it be like Strom's brutal indifference or Zoronos' violent desire? Valenzo was recovering from the shock of finding a stranger within his very hall. He knew Conan was a Cimmerian, born and bred in the wastes of the far north, and therefore not amenable to the physical limitations which controlled civilized men. It was not so strange that he had been able to enter the fort undetected, but Valenzo flinched at the reflection that other barbarians might duplicate that feat, the dark, silent Picts, for instance.
What do you want here?
He demanded.
Did you come from the sea?
I came from the woods.
The Cimmerian jerked his head toward the east.
You have been living with the Picts?
Valenzo asked coldly. A momentary anger flickered bluely in the giant's eyes.
Even as a Garan ought to know there's never been peace between Picts and Cimmerians, and never will be,
he retorted with an oath.
Our feud with them is older than the world. If you'd said that to one of my wilder brothers, you'd have found yourself with a split head. But I've lived among you civilized men long enough to understand your ignorance and lack of common courtesy, the churlishness that demands his business of a man who appears at your door out of 1,000-mile wilderness. Never mind that.
He turned to the two freebooters who stood staring glumly at him.
From what I overheard,
quoth he,
I gather there is some dissension over a map.
That is none of your affair,
growled Strom.
Is this it?
Conan grinned wickedly and drew from his pocket a crumpled object, a square of parchment marked with crimson lines. Strom stared violently, paling.
My map,
he ejaculated.
Where did you get it?
From your mate, Galacus, when I killed him,
answered Conan with grim enjoyment.
You dog,
raved Strom, turning on Zorono.
You never had a map. You lied. I didn't say I had it,
snarled Zorono.
You deceived yourself. Don't be a fool. Conan is alone. If he had a crew, he'd have already cut our throats. We'll take the map from him.
You'll never touch it.
Conan laughed fiercely. Both men sprang at him, cursing. Stepping back, he crumpled the parchment and cast it into the glowing coals of the fireplace. With an incoherent bellow, Strum lunged past him to be met with a buffet under the ear that stretched him half senseless on the floor. Zarono whipped out his sword, but before he could thrust, Conan's cutlass beat it out of his hand. Zarono staggered against the table, with all hell in his eyes. Strum dragged himself erect, his eyes glazed, blood dripping from his bruised ear. Conan leaned slightly over the table, his outstretched cutlass just touched the breast of Count Veloso.
"Don't call for your soldiers, Count,"
said the Cimmerian softly.
"Not a sound out of you, or from you either, Dogface."
His name for Galbro, who showed no intention of braving his wrath.
"The maps burn to ashes, and it'll do no good to spill blood. Sit down, all of you."
Strum hesitated, made an abortive gesture toward his hilt, then shrugged his shoulders and sank sullenly into a chair. The others followed suit. Conan remained standing, towering over the table, while his enemies watched him with bitter eyes of hate.
"You were bargaining,"
he said.
"That's all I've come to do."
"And what have you to trade?"
sneered Zarono.
"The treasure of Tranicos."
"What?" All four men were on their feet, leaning toward him.
"Sit down,"
he roared, banging his broad blade on the table. They sank back, tense and white with excitement. He grinned in huge enjoyment of the sensation his words had caused.
"Yes, I found it before I got the map. That's why I burned the map. I don't need it. And now nobody will ever find it unless I show him where it is."
They stared at him with murder in their eyes.
"You're lying,"
said Zarono without conviction.
"You told us one lie already. You said you came from the woods, yet you say you haven't been living with the Picts. All men know this country is a wilderness, inhabited only by savages. The nearest outpost of civilization are the Aquilonian settlements on Thunder River, hundreds of miles to eastward."
"That's where I came from,"
replied Conan imperturbably.
"I believe I'm the first white man to cross the Pictish wilderness. I crossed Thunder River to follow a raiding party that had been harrying the frontier. I followed them deep into the wilderness and killed their chief, but was knocked senseless by a stone from a sling during the melee, and the dogs captured me alive. They were wolfmen, but they traded me to the Eagle clan in return for a chief of theirs the Eagles had captured. The Eagles carried me nearly 100 miles westward to burn me in their chief village, but I killed their war chief and 3 or 4 others one night and broke away. I couldn't turn back. They were behind me and kept herding me westward. A few days ago I shook them off, and by Crom, the place where I took refuge turned out to be the treasure trove of all Tranicos. I found it all, chests of garments and weapons. That's where I got these clothes and this blade, heaps of coins and gems and gold ornaments, and in the midst of all, the jewels of Dot McCree gleaming like frozen starlight, and all Tranicos and his 11 captains sitting about an even table and staring at the board as they've stared for 100 years. What? Aye, he laughed. Tranicos died in the midst of his treasure, and all with him. Their bodies have not rotted nor shriveled. They sit there in their high boots and skirted coats and lacquered hats, with their wine glasses in their stiff hands, just as they have sat for a century.
"That's an unchancy thing,"
muttered Strum uneasily, but Zarono snarled,
"What boots it? It's the treasure we want. Go on, Conan."
Conan seated himself at the board, filled a goblet, and quaffed it before he answered.
"The first wine I've drunk since I left Caughnawaga, boy Crom. Those cursed eagles hunted me so closely through the forest I had hardly time to munch the nuts and roots I found. Sometimes I caught frogs and ate them raw because I dared not light a fire."
His impatient hearers informed him profanely that they were not interested in his adventures prior to finding the treasure. He grinned hardly and resumed.
"Well, after I stumbled onto the trove, I lay up and rested a few days and made snares to catch rabbits and let my wounds heal. I saw smoke against the western sky, but thought it some Pictish village on the beach. I lay close, but as it happens, the loot is hidden in a place the Picts shun. If any spied on me, they didn't show themselves. Last night, I started westward, intending to strike the beach some miles north of the spot where I'd seen the smoke. I wasn't far from the shore when that storm hit. I took shelter under the lee of a rock and waited until it had blown itself out. Then I climbed a tree to look for Picts, and from it I saw your carrack at anchor, Strum, and your men coming in to shore. I was making my way toward your camp on the beach when I met Galacus. I shoved a sword through him because there was an old feud between us. I wouldn't have known he had a map if he hadn't tried to eat it before he died. I recognized it for what it was, of course, and was considering what use I could make of it when the rest of you dogs came up and found the body. I was lying in a thicket not a dozen yards from you while you were arguing with your men over the matter. I judged the time wasn't ripe for me to show myself then."
He laughed at the rage and chagrin displayed in Storm's face.
"Well, while I lay there listening to you talk, I got a drift of the situation and learned from the things you let fall that Zarono and Valenzo were a few miles south of the beach. So, when I heard you say that Zarono must have done the killing and taken the map, and that you meant to go and parley with him, seeking an opportunity to murder him and get it back, dog," snarled Zarono.
Strum was livid, but he laughed mirthlessly.
"Do you think I played fairly with a treacherous dog like you? Go on, Conan."
The Cimmerian grinned. It was evident that he was deliberately fanning the fires of hate between the two men.
"Nothing much then. I came straight through the woods while you tacked along the coast and raised the fort before you did. Your guess that the storm had destroyed Zeronos' ship was a good one, but then you knew the configuration of this bay. Well, there's the story. I have the treasure, Strum has a ship, Valenzo has supplies. By Crom Zarono, I don't see where you fit into the scheme, but to avoid strife, I'll include you. My proposal is simple enough. We'll split the treasure 4 ways. Strum and I will sail away with our shares aboard the Red Hand. You and Valenzo take yours and remain Lord of the Wilderness, or build a ship out of tree trunks as you wish."
Valenzo blenched and Zarono swore while Strum grinned quietly.
"Are you fool enough to go aboard the Red Hand alone with Strum?"
snarled Zarono.
"He'll cut your throat before you're out of sight of land."
Conan laughed with genuine enjoyment.
"This is like the problem of the sheep, the wolf, and the cabbage," he admitted. "How to get them across the river without they're devouring each other.
And that appeals to your Cimmerian sense of humor,
complained Zarono.
I will not stay here,
cried Valenzo, a wild gleam in his dark eyes.
Treasure or no treasure, I must go.
Conan gave him a slit-eyed glance of speculation.
Well then, said he, how about this plan? We divide the loot as I suggested. Then Strum sails away with Zarono, Valenzo, and such members of the Count's household as he may select, leaving me in command of the fort and the rest of Valenzo's men and all of Zarono's. I'll build my own ship.
Zarono looked slightly sick.
I have the chance of remaining here in exile or abandoning my crew and going out alone on the Red Hand to have my throat cut.
Conan's laughter rang gustily through the hall, and he smote Zarono jovially on the back, ignoring the black murder in the buccaneer's glare.
That's it, Zarono, quoth he. Stay here while Strum and I sail away, or sail away with Strum, leaving your men with me.
I'd rather have Zarono, said Strum frankly. You'd turn my own men against me, Conan, and cut my throat before I raise the Barachans.
Sweat dripped from Zarono's livid face.
Neither I, the Count, nor his niece will ever reach the land alive if we ship with that devil,
said he.
You are both in my power in this hole, my men surround it. What's to prevent me cutting you both down?
Not a thing,
Conan admitted cheerfully,
except the fact that if you do, Strum's men will sail away and leave you stranded on this coast, where the Picts will presently cut all your throats, and the fact that with me dead you'll never find the treasure, and the fact that I'll split your skull down to your chin if you try to summon your men.
Conan laughed as he spoke, as if at some whimsical situation, but even Belessa sensed that he meant what he said. His naked cutlass lay across his knees, and Zarono's sword was under the table, out of the buccaneer's reach. Galbro was not a fighting man, and Valenzo seemed incapable of decision or action.
Aye,
said Strum with an oath.
You'll find the two of us no easy prey. I'm agreeable to Conan's proposal. What do you say?
I must leave this coast, whispered Valenzo, staring blankly. I must hasten. I must go far, quickly. Strum frowned, puzzled at the Count's strange manner, and turned to Zarono, grinning wickedly.
And you, Zarono? What can I say?
Snarled Zarono.
Let me take my 3 officers and 40 men aboard the Red Hand, and the bargain is made. 3 officers and 30 men.
There was no shaking of hands or ceremonial drinking of wine to seal the pact. The 2 captains glared at each other like hungry wolves. The Count plucked his mustache with a trembling hand, wrapped in his own somber thoughts. Conan stretched like a great cat, drank wine, and grinned on the assemblage, but it was the sinister grin of a stalking tiger. Belessa sensed the murderous purposes that reigned there, the treacherous intent that dominated each man's mind. Not one had any intention of keeping his part of the pact, Valenzo possibly excluded. Each of the freebooters intended to possess both the ship and the entire treasure. Neither would be satisfied with less. But how? What was going on in each crafty mind? Belessa felt oppressed and stifled by the atmosphere of hatred and treachery. The Cimmerian, for all his ferocious frankness, was no less subtle than the others, and even fiercer. His domination of the situation was not physical alone, though his gigantic shoulders and massive limbs seemed too big even for the great hall. There was an iron vitality about the man that overshadowed even the hard vigor of the other freebooters.
Lead us to the treasure,
Zarono demanded.
Wait a bit,
answered Conan.
we must keep our power evenly balanced so one can't take advantage of the others. We'll work it this way. Strom's men will come ashore, all but half a dozen or so, and camp on the beach. Zaronos' men will come out of the fort and likewise camp on the strand within easy sight of them. Then each crew can keep a check on the other to see that nobody slips after us who go after the treasure to ambush any of us. Those left aboard the Red Hand will take her out into the bay out of reach of either party. Valonsos' men will stay in the fort but will leave the gate open. Will you come with us, Count?
Go into that forest?
Valenso shuddered and drew his cloak about his shoulders.
Not for all the gold of Tranicos.
All right, I'll take about 30 men to carry the loot. We'll take 15 from each crew and start as soon as possible.
Pelessa, keenly alert to every angle of the drama being played out beneath her, saw Zarono and Strom shoot furtive glances at one another, then lowered their gaze quickly as they lifted their glasses to hide the murky intent in their eyes. Pelessa saw the fatal weakness in Conan's plan and wondered how he could have overlooked it. Perhaps he was too arrogantly confident in his own personal prowess, but she knew that he would never have come out of that forest alive. Once the treasure was in their grasp, the others would form a rogues' alliance long enough to rid themselves of the man both hated. She shuddered, staring morbidly at the man she knew was doomed. Strange to see that powerful fighting man sitting there, laughing and swilling wine in full prime and power, and to know that he was already doomed to a bloody death. The whole situation was pregnant with dark and bloody portents. Zarono would trick and kill Strom if he could, and she knew that Strom had already marked Zarono for death, and doubtless also her uncle and herself. If Zarono won the final battle of cruel wits, their lives were safe, but looking at the buccaneer as he sat there chewing his mustache, with all the stark evil of his nature showing naked in his dark face, she could not decide which was more abhorrent, death or Zarono.
How far is it?
demanded Strom.
If we start within the hour, we can be back before midnight,
answered Conan. He emptied his glass, rose, adjusted his girdle, and glanced at the Count.
Valenso,
he said,
are you mad to kill a Pict in his hunting paint?
Valenso started.
What do you mean?
Do you mean to say you don't know that your men killed a Pict hunter in the woods last night?
The Count shook his head.
None of my men was in the woods last night.
Well, somebody was,
grunted the Cimmerian, fumbling in a pocket.
I saw his head nailed to a tree near the edge of the forest. He wasn't painted for war. I didn't find any boot tracks, from which I judged that it had been nailed up there before the storm. But there were plenty of other signs. Moccasin tracks on the wet ground. Picts have been there and seen that head. They were men of some other clan, or they'd have taken it down. If they happen to be at peace with the clan that dead man belonged to, they'll make tracks to his village and tell his tribe.
Perhaps they killed him,
suggested Valenso.
No, they didn't. But they know who did, for the same reason that I know. This chain was knotted about the stump of the severe neck. You must have been utterly mad to identify your handiwork like that.
He drew forth something and tossed it on the table before the Count, who lurched up, choking, as his hand flew to his throat. It was the gold seal chain he habitually wore about his neck.
I recognized the Corzetta seal,
said Conan.
The presence of that chain will tell any Pict it was the work of a foreigner.
Valenzo did not reply. He sat staring at the chain as if at a venomous serpent. Conan scowled at him and glanced questioningly at the others. Zarano made a quick gesture to indicate the Count was not quite right in the head. Conan sheathed his cutlass and donned his lacquered hat.
All right, let's go.
The captains gulped down their wine and rose, hitching at their sword hilts. Zarano laid a hand on Valenzo's arm and shook him slightly. The Count started and stared about him, then followed the others out like a man in a daze, the chain dangling from his fingers. But not all left the hall. Bellezza and Tina, forgotten on the stair, peeping between the balusters, saw Galbro fall behind the others, loitering until the heavy door closed after them. Then he hurried to the fireplace and raked carefully at the smoldering coals. He sank to his knees and peered closely at something for a long space. Then he straightened and with a furtive air stole out of the hall by another door.
"What did Galbro find in the fire?"
whispered Tina. Bellezza shook her head, then, obeying the promptings of her curiosity, rose and went down to the empty hall. An instant later, she was kneeling where the seneschal had knelt, and she saw what he had seen. It was the charred remnant of the map Conan had thrown into the fire. It was ready to crumble at a touch, but faint lines and bits of writing were still discernible upon it. She could not read the writing, but she could trace the outlines of what seemed to be the picture of a hill or crag, surrounded by marks evidently representing dense trees. She could make nothing of it, but from Galbros's actions she believed he recognized it as portraying some scene or topographical feature familiar to him. She knew the seneschal had penetrated inland further than any other man of the settlement. Chapter 6. The Plunder of the Dead. Bellezza came down the stair and paused at the sight of Count Valenzo seated at the table, turning the broken chain about in his hands. She looked at him without love and with more than a little fear. The change that had come over him was appalling. He seemed to be locked up in a grim world all of his own, with a fear that flogged all human characteristics out of him. The fortress stood strangely quiet in the noonday heat that had followed the storm of the dawn. Voices of people within the stockade sounded subdued, muffled. The same drowsy stillness reigned on the beach outside, where the rival crews lay in armed suspicion, separated by a few hundred yards of bare sand. Far out in the bay the Red Hand lay at anchor with a handful of men aboard her, ready to snatch her out of reach at the slightest indication of treachery. The carrack was Strom's trump card, his best guarantee against the trickery of his associates. Conan had plotted shrewdly to eliminate the chances of an ambush in the forest by either party. But as far as Bellezza could see, he had failed utterly to safeguard himself against the treachery of his companions. He had disappeared into the woods, leading the two captains and their 30 men, and the Zigaran girl was positive that she would never see him alive again. Presently she spoke, and her voice was strained and harsh to her own ear.
"The barbarian has led the captains into the forest. When they have the gold in their hands, they'll kill him. But when they return with the treasure, what then? Are we to go aboard the ship? Can we trust Strom?"
Valenzo shook his head absently.
"Strom would murder us all for our shares of the loot. But Zarano whispered his intentions to me secretly. We will not go aboard the Red Hand, save as her masters. Zarono will see that night overtakes the treasure party, so they are forced to camp in the forest. He will find a way to kill Strom and his men in their sleep. Then the buccaneers will come on stealthily to the beach. Just before dawn, I will send some of my fishermen secretly from the fort to swim out to the ship and seize her. Strom never thought of that, neither did Conan. Zarono and his men will come out of the forest and, with the buccaneers encamped on the beach, fall upon the pirates in the dark, while I lead my men-at-arms from the fort to complete the rout. Without their captain, they will be demoralized and outnumbered, fall easy prey to Zarono and me. Then we will sail in Strom's ship with all the treasure. And what of me? She asked with dry lips. I have promised you to Zarono, he answered harshly, but for my promise he would not take us off. I will never marry him, she said helplessly. You will, he responded gloomily and without the slightest touch of sympathy. He lifted the chain so it caught the gleam of the sun slanting through the window. I must have dropped it on the sand, he muttered. He has been that near on the beach. You did not drop it on the strand, said Bellessa in a voice as devoid of mercy as his own. Her soul seemed turned to stone. You tore it from your throat by accident last night in this hall when you flogged Tina. I saw it gleaming on the floor before I left the hall. He looked up, his face grey with terrible fear. She laughed bitterly, sensing the mute question in his dilated eyes. Yes, the black man. He was here, in this hall. He must have found the chain on the floor. The guardsman did not see him, but he was at your door last night. I saw him, padding along the upper hallway. For an instant, she thought he would drop dead of sheer terror. He sank back in his chair, the chain slipping from his nerveless fingers and clinking on the table. In the manor, he whispered. I thought bolts and bars and armed guards could keep him out. Fool that I was. I can no more guard against him than I can escape him. At my door! At my door! The thought overwhelmed him with horror. Why did he not enter? He shrieked, tearing at the lace upon his collar as though it strangled him. Why did he not end it? I have dreamed of waking in my darkened chamber to see him squatting above me and the blue hellfire playing about his horned head. Why? The paroxysm passed, leaving him faint and trembling. I understand, he panted. He's playing with me as a cat with a mouse. To have slain me last night in my chamber were too easy, too merciful. So he destroyed the ship in which I might have escaped him. And he slew that wretched Pict and left my chain upon him, so that the savages might believe I had slain him. They have seen that chain upon my neck many a time. But why? What subtle deviltry has he in mind? What devious purpose no human mind can grasp or understand? Who is this black man? Asked Bellessa, chill fear crawling along her spine. A demon loosed by my greed and lust to plague me throughout eternity, he whispered. He spread his long, thin fingers on the table before him and stared at her with hollow, weirdly luminous eyes that seemed to see her not at all, but to look through her and far beyond to some dim doom. In my youth I had an enemy at court, he said, as if speaking more to himself than to her. A powerful man who stood between me and my ambition. In my lust for wealth and power, I sought aid from the people of the black arts. A black magician who, at my desire, raised up a fiend from the outer gulfs of existence and clothed it in the form of a man. It crushed and slew my enemy. I grew great and wealthy, and none could stand before me. But I thought to cheat my fiend of the price a mortal must pay who calls the black folk to do his bidding. By his grim arts the magician tricked the soulless waif of darkness and bound him in hell, where he howled in vain, I supposed for eternity. but because the sorcerer had given the fiend the form of a man, he could never break the link that bound it to the material world, never completely close the cosmic corridors by which it had gained access to this planet. A year ago in Cordava, word came to me that the magician, now an ancient man, had been slain in his castle with marks of demon fingers on his throat. Then I knew that the Black One had escaped from hell, where the magician had bound him, and that he would seek vengeance upon me. One night I saw his demon face leering at me from the shadows in my castle hall. It was not his material body, but his spirit sent to plague me, his spirit which could not follow me over the windy waters. Before he could reach Cordava in the flesh, I sailed to put broad seas between me and him. He has his limitations. To follow me across the seas, he must remain in his man-like body of flesh. But that flesh is not human flesh. He can be slain, I think, by fire, though the magician, having raised him up, was powerless to slay him. Such are the limits set upon the powers of sorcerers. But the Black One is too crafty to be trapped or slain. When he hides himself, no man can find him. He steals like a shadow through the night, making naught of bolts and bars. He blinds the eyes of guardsmen with sleep. He can raise storms and commands the serpents of the deep and the fiends of the night. I hoped to drown my trail in the blue rolling wastes, but he has tracked me down to claim his grim forfeit. The grim eyes lit palely as he gazed beyond the tapestried walls to far, invisible horizons. "I'll trick him yet," he whispered. "Let him delay to strike this night. Dawn will find me with a ship under my heels, and again I will cast an ocean between me and his vengeance."
"Hell's fire!"
Conan stopped short, glaring upward. Behind him the seamen halted, two compact clumps of them, bows in their hands and suspicion in their attitude. They were following an old path made by Pictish hunters which led due east, and though they had progressed only some 30 yards, the beach was no longer visible.
"What is it?"
demanded Strom suspiciously.
"What are you stopping for?"
"Are you blind? Look there!"
From the thick limb of a tree that overhung the trail, a head grinned down at them. A dark painted face, framed in thick black hair, in which a toucan feather drooped over the left ear.
"I took that head down and hid it in the bushes,"
growled Conan, scanning the woods about them narrowly.
"What fool could have stuck it back up there? It looks as if somebody was trying his damnedest to bring the Picts down on the settlement."
Men glanced at each other darkly, a new element of suspicion added to the already seething cauldron. Conan climbed a tree, secured the head and carried it into the bushes, where he tossed it into a stream and saw it sink.
"The Picts whose tracks are about this tree weren't toucans,"
he growled, returning through the thicket.
"I've sailed these ghosts enough to know something about the Sealand tribes. If I read the prints of their moccasins right, they were cormorants. I hope they're having a war with the toucans. If they're at peace, they'll head straight for the toucan village, and they'll be held to pay. I don't know how far away that village is, but as soon as they learn of this murder, they'll come through the forest like starving wolves. That's the worst insult possible to a Pict. Kill a man not in war paint and stick his head up in a tree for the vultures to eat. Damn peculiar things going on along this coast. But that's always the way when civilized men come into the wilderness. They're all crazy as hell. Come on."
Men loosened blades in their scabbards and shafts in their quivers as they strode deeper into the forest. Men of the sea, accustomed to the rolling expanses of grey water, they were ill at ease with the green mysterious walls of trees and vines hemming them in. The path wound and twisted until most of them quickly lost their sense of direction and did not even know in which direction the beach lay. Conan was uneasy for another reason. He kept scanning the trail and finally grunted.
Somebody's passed along here recently. No more than an hour ahead of us. Somebody in boots with no woodscraft. Was he the fool who found that Pixie's head and stuck it back up into that tree? No, it couldn't have been him. I didn't find his tracks under the tree. But who was it? I didn't find any tracks there, except those of the Picts I seen already. And who's this fellow hurrying ahead of us? Did either of you bastards send a man ahead of us for any reason?
Both Strom and Zerono loudly disclaim any such act, glaring at each other with mutual disbelief. Neither man could see the signs Conan pointed out, the faint prints which he saw on the grassless, hard-beaten trail were invisible to their untrained eyes. Conan quickened his pace and they hurried after him, fresh coals of suspicion added to the smouldering fire of distrust. Presently the path veered northward and Conan left it and began threading his way through the dense trees in a southeasterly direction. Strom stole an uneasy glance at Zerono. This might force a change in their plans. Within a few hundred feet from the trail, both were hopelessly lost and convinced of their inability to find their way back to the path. They were shaken by the fear that, after all, the Cimmerian had a force at his command and was leading them into an ambush. This suspicion grew as they advanced and had almost reached panic proportions when they emerged from the thick woods and saw just ahead of them a gaunt crag that jutted up from the forest floor. A dim path leading out of the woods from the east ran among a cluster of boulders and wound up the crag on a ladder of stony shelves to a flat ledge near the summit. Conan halted, a bizarre figure in his piratical finery.
That trail is the one I followed, running from the Eagle Picts,
he said.
It leads up to a cave behind that ledge. In that cave are the bodies of Tranicos and his captains, and the treasure he plundered from Totmekri. But a word before we go up after it. If you kill me here, you'll never find your way back to the trail we followed from the beach. I know you seafaring men. You're helpless in the deep woods. Of course, the beach lies due west, but if you have to make your way through the tangled woods burdened with the plunder, it'll take you not hours, but days. And I don't think these woods will be very safe for white men when the Tucans learn about their hunter.
He laughed at them ghastly, mirthless smiles with which they greeted his recognition of their intentions regarding him. And he also comprehended the thought that sprang in the mind of each. Let the barbarian secure the loot for them and lead them back to the beach trail before they killed him.
All of you can stay here except Strom and Zerono, said Conan. We three are enough to pack the treasure down from the cave.
Strom grinned mercilessly.
Go up there with you and Zerono. Do you take me for a fool? One man at least comes with me.
And he designated his boatswain, a brawny, hard-faced giant, naked to his broad leather belt, with gold hoops in his ears and a crimson scarf knotted about his head.
And my executioner comes with me,
growled Zerono. He beckoned to a lean sea thief with a face like a parchment-covered skull, who carried a two-handed scimitar naked over his bony shoulder. Conan shrugged his shoulders.
Very well, follow me.
They were close on his heels as he strode up the winding path and mounted the ledge. They crowded him close as he passed through the cleft in the wall behind it, and their breath sucked greedily between their teeth as he called their attention to the iron-bound chests on either side of that short tunnel-like cavern.
A rich cargo there,
he said carelessly.
Silks, laces, garments, ornaments, weapons, the loot of the southern seas. But the real treasure lies beyond that door.
The massive door stood partly open. Conan frowned. He remembered closing that door before he left the cavern, but he said nothing of the matter to his eager companions as he drew aside to let them look through. They looked into a wide cavern, lit by a strange blue glow that glimmered through a smoky mist-like haze. A great ebon table stood in the midst of the cavern, and in a carved chair was a high back and broad arms that might once have stood in the castle of some Zingaran baron, sat a giant figure, fabulous and fantastic. There sat bloody Tranicos, his great head sunk on his bosom, one brawny hand still gripping a jewel goblet in which wine still sparkled. Tranicos, in his lacquered hat, his gilt-embroidered coat with jeweled buttons that winked in the blue flame, his flaring boots and gold-work baldric that upheld a jewel-hilted sword in a golden sheath. And ranging the board, each with his chin resting on his lace-bedecked crest, sat the 11 captains. The blue fire played weirdly on them and on their giant admiral, as it flowed from the enormous jewel on the tiny ivory pedestal, striking glints of frozen fire from the heaps of fantastically cut gems which shone before the place of Tranicos, the plunder of Kemi, the jewels of Thutmekri. The stones whose value was greater than the value of all the rest of the known jewels in the world put together. The faces of Zarono and Strom showed pallid in the blue glow. Over their shoulders their men gaped stupidly.
Go on and take them,
invited Conan, drawing aside, and Zarono and Strom crowded avidly past him, jostling one another in their haste. Their followers were treading on their heels. Zarono kicked the door wide open and halted with one foot on the threshold at the sight of a figure on the floor, previously hidden from view by the partly closed door. It was a man, prone and contorted, head thrown back between his shoulders, white face twisted in a grin of mortal agony, gripping his own throat with clawed fingers.
Galbro!
Ejaculated Zarono.
Dead! What?
With sudden suspicion he thrust his head over the threshold into the bluish mist that filled the inner cavern, and he screamed chokingly,
There is death in the smoke!
Even as he screamed, Conan hurled his weight against the 4 men bunched in the doorway, sending them staggering, but not headlong, into the mist-filled cavern as he had planned. They were recoiling at the sight of the dead man and the realization of the trap and his violent push, while it threw them off their feet, yet failed of the result he desired. Strom and Zarono sprawled half over the threshold on their knees, the boatswain tumbling over their legs, and the executioner caromed against the wall. Before Conan could follow up his ruthless intention of kicking the fallen men into the cavern and holding the door against them until the poisonous mist did its deadly work, he had to turn and defend himself against the frothing onslaught of the executioner, who was the first to regain his balance and his wits. The buccaneer missed a tremendous swipe with his headman's sword as the Cimmerian ducked, and the great blade banged against the stone wall, spattering blue sparks. The next instant, his skull-faced head rolled on the cavern floor under the bite of Conan's cutlass. In the split seconds this swift action consumed, the boatswain regained his feet and fell on the Cimmerian, raining blows with a cutlass that would have overwhelmed a lesser man. Cutlass met cutlass with a ring of steel that was deafening in the narrow cavern. The two captains rolled back across the threshold, gagging and gasping, purple in the face and too near strangled to shout, and Conan redoubled his efforts in an endeavor to dispose of his antagonist and cut down his rivals before they could recover from the effects of the poison. The boatswain dripped blood at each step as he was driven back before the ferocious onslaught, and he began desperately to bellow for his companions. But before Conan could deal the finishing stroke, the two chiefs, gasping but murderous, came at him with swords in their hands, croaking for their men. The Cimmerian bounded back and leaped out onto the ledge. He felt himself a match for all three men, though each was a famed swordsman, but he did not wish to be trapped by the crews, which would come charging up the path at the sound of the battle. These were not coming with as much celerity as he expected, however. They were bewildered at the sounds and muffled shouts issuing from the cavern above them, but no man dared start up the path for fear of a sword in the back. Each band faced the other tensely, grasping their weapons but incapable of decision, and when they saw the Cimmerian bound out on the ledge, they still hesitated. While they stood with their arrows nocked, he ran up the ladder of handholds niched in the rock near the clefts and threw himself prone on the summit of the crag, out of their sight. The captains stormed out on the ledge, raving and brandishing their swords, and their men, seeing their leaders were not at sword strokes, ceased menacing each other and gaped bewilderedly.
"Dog!"
screamed Zarono.
"You plan to poison us, traitor!"
Conan mocked them from above.
Well, what did you expect? You two were planning to cut my throat as soon as I cut the plunder for you. If it hadn't been for that fool Galbro, I'd have trapped the four of you and explained to your men how you rushed in heedless to your doom.
"And with us both dead, you'd have taken my ship and all the loot too,"
throated Strum.
Aye, and the pick of each crew. I've been wanting to get back on the main for months, and this was a good opportunity. It was Galbros's footprints I saw on the trail. I wonder how the fool learned of this cave, or how he expected to lug away the loot by himself.
"But for the sight of his body, we would have walked into that death trap,"
muttered Zarono, his swarthy face still ashy.
"That blue smoke was like unseen fingers crushing my throat."
Well, what are you going to do?
Their tormentor yelled sardonically.
"What are we to do?"
Zarono asked Strum.
"The treasure cavern is filled with that poisonous mist, though for some reason it does not flow across the threshold."
You can't get the treasure.
Conan assured them with satisfaction from his eyrie.
That smoke will strangle you. It nearly got me when I stepped in there. Listen, I'll tell you a tale the Picts tell in their huts when the fires burn low. Once, long ago, 12 strange men came out of the sea and found a cave and heaped it with gold and the jewels. But the Pictish shaman made magic and the earth shook, and smoke came out of the earth and strangled them where they sat at wine. The smoke, which was the smoke of Hell's fire, was confined within the cavern by the magic of the wizard. The tale was told from tribe to tribe, and all the clans shunned the accursed spot. When I crawled in there to escape the eagle Picts, I realized that the old legend was true, and referred to old Tranicos and his men. and earthquake cracked the rock floor of the cavern, while he and his captains sat at wine and let the mist out of the depths of the earth, doubtless out of hell, as the Picts say. Death guards all Tranicos' treasure.
Bring up the men,
frothed Strum.
we'll climb up and hew him down.
Don't be a fool, snarled Zarono. Do you think any man on earth would climb those handholds in the teeth of his sword? We'll have the men up here right enough to feather him with shafts if he dares show himself. But we'll get those gems yet. He had some plan of obtaining the loot, or he wouldn't have brought 30 men to bear it back. If he could get it, so can we. We'll bend a cutlass blade to make a hook, tie it to a rope, and cast it about the leg of that table, then drag it to the door.
Well thought, Zarono,
came down Conan's mocking voice.
Exactly what I had in mind. But how will you find your way back to the beach path? It will be dark long before you reach the beach. If you have to feel your way through the woods, and I'll follow you and kill you one by one in the dark.
It's no empty boast, muttered Strum. He can move and strike in the dark as subtly and silently as a ghost. If he hunts us back through the forest, few of us will live to see the beach. Then we'll kill him here, gritted Zarono. Some of us will shoot at him while the rest climb the crag. If he is not struck by arrows, some of us will reach him with our swords. Listen, why does he laugh?
To hear dead men making plots,
came Conan's grimly amused voice. Heed him not, scowled Zarono, and lifting his voice, shouted for the men below to join him and Strum on the ledge. The sailors started up the slanting trail, and one started to shout a question. Simultaneously, there sounded a hum like that of an angry bee, ending in a sharp thud. The buccaneer gasped, and blood gushed from his open mouth. He sank to his knees, clutching the black shaft that quivered in his breast. A yell of alarm went up from his companions.
"What's the matter?"
shouted Strum.
"Picts!"
bawled the pirate, lifting his bow and loosing blindly. At his side a man moaned and went down with an arrow through his throat.
"Take cover, you fools!"
shrieked Zarono. From his vantage point he glimpsed painted figures moving in the bushes. One of the men on the winding path fell back dying. The rest scrambled hastily down among the rocks about the foot of the crag. They took cover clumsily, not used to this kind of fighting. Arrows flickered from bushes, splintering on the boulders. The man on the ledge lay prone at full length.
"We are trapped!"
Strum's face was pale. Bold enough, with a deck under his feet, this silent, savage warfare shook his ruthless nerves.
"Conan said they feared this crag,"
said Zarono.
"When night falls, the men must climb up here. We'll hold the crag. Picts won't rush us."
"Aye,"
mocked Conan above them.
"They won't climb the crag to get at you, that's true. They'll merely surround it and keep you here until you all die of thirst and starvation."
"He speaks truth,"
said Zarono helplessly.
"What shall we do?" "Make a truce with him,"
muttered Strum.
"If any man can get us out of this gem, he can. Time enough to cut his throat later."
Lifting his voice, he called,
"Conan, let's forget our feud for the time being. You're in this fix as much as we are. Come down and help us out of it."
"How do you figure that?"
retorted the Cimmerian.
"I have but to wait until dark, climb down the other side of this crag, and melt into the forest. I can crawl through the line the Picts have thrown around this hill, and return to the fort to report you all slain by the savages, which will shortly be truth."
Zarono and Strum stared at each other in pallid silence.
"But I'm not going to do that,"
Conan roared.
"Not because I have any love for you dogs, but because a white man doesn't leave white men, even his enemies, to be butchered by Picts.
The Cimmerian's tousled black head appeared over the crest of the crag.
Now listen closely. That's only a small band down there. I saw them sneaking through the brush when I left a while ago. Anyway, if there had been many of them, every man at the foot of the crag would be dead already. I think that's a band of fleet-footed young men sent ahead of the main war party to cut us off from the beach. I'm certain a big war band is heading in our direction from somewhere. They've thrown a cordon around the west side of the crag, but I don't think there are any on the east side. I'm going down on that side and get into the forest and work around behind them. Meanwhile, you crawl down the path and join your men among the rocks. Tell them to sling their bows and draw their swords. When you hear me yell, rush the trees on the west side of the clearing.
What of the treasure?
To hell with the treasure. We'll be lucky if we get out of here with our heads on our shoulders.
The black-maned head vanished. They listened for sounds to indicate that Conan had crawled to the almost sheer eastern wall and was working his way down, but they heard nothing, nor was there any sound in the forest. No more arrows broke against the rocks where the sailors were hidden, but all knew that fierce black eyes were watching with murderous patience. Gingerly Strum, Zerono and the boatswain started down the winding path. They were halfway down when the black shafts began to whisper around them. The boatswain groaned and toppled limply down the slope, shot through the heart. Arrows shivered on the helmets and breastplates of the chiefs as they tumbled in frantic haste down the steep trail. They reached the foot in a scrambling rush and lay panting among the boulders, swearing breathlessly.
Is this more of Conan's trickery?
Wondered Zerono profanely.
We must trust him in this matter,
asserted Strum.
These barbarians lived by their own particular code of honor, and Conan would never desert men of his own complexion to be slaughtered by people of another race. He'll help us against the Picts, even though he plans to murder us himself. Hark!
A blood-freezing yell knifed the silence. It came from the woods to the west, and simultaneously an object arched out of the trees, struck the ground and rolled bouncingly towards the rocks. A severed human head, the hideously painted face frozen in a snarl of death.
Conan's signal!
Roared Strum, and the desperate freebooters rose like a wave from the rocks and rushed headlong toward the woods. Arrows whirred out of the bushes, but their flight was hurried and erratic. Only 3 men fell. Then the wild men of the sea plunged through the fringe of foliage and fell on the naked painted figures that rose out of the gloom before them. There was a murderous instant of panting, ferocious effort, hand to hand, cutlasses beating down war axes, booted feet trampling naked bodies, and then bare feet were rattling through the bushes in headlong flight as the survivors of that brief carnage quit the fray, leaving 7 still, painted figures stretched on the blood-stained leaves that littered the earth. Further back in the thickets sounded a threshing and heaving, and then it ceased, and Conan strode into view, his lacquered hat gone, his coat torn, his cutlass dripping in his hand.
What now?
Panted Zerono. He knew the charge had succeeded only because Conan's unexpected attack on the rear of the Picts had demoralized the painted men and prevented them from falling back before the rush. But he exploded into curses as Conan passed his cutlass through a buccaneer who writhed on the ground with a shattered hip.
We can't carry him with us,
grunted Conan.
It wouldn't be any kindness to leave him to be taken alive by the Picts. Come on.
They crowded close at his heels as he trotted through the trees. Alone they would have sweated and blundered among the thickets for hours before they found the beach trail, if they had ever found it. The Cimmerian led them as unerringly as if he had been following a blazed path, and the rovers shouted with hysterical relief as they burst suddenly upon the trail that ran westward.
Fool!
Conan clapped a hand on the shoulder of a pirate who started to break into a run and hurled him back among his companions.
You'll burst your heart and fall within 1,000 yards. We're miles from the beach. Take an easy gait. We may have to sprint the last mile. Save some of your wind for it. Come on now.
He set off down the trail at a steady jog trot. The seamen followed him, suiting their pace to his. The sun was touching the waves of the western ocean. Tina stood at the window from which Belessa had watched the storm.
"The setting sun turns the ocean to blood,"
she said.
"The Kerex's sail is a white fleck on the crimson waters. The woods are already darkened with clustering shadows." "What of the seamen on the beach?"
asked Belessa languidly. She reclined on a couch, her eyes closed, her hand clasped behind her head.
"Both camps are preparing their supper,"
said Tina.
"They gather driftwood and build fires. I can hear them shouting to one another." "What is that?"
The sudden tenseness in the girl's tone brought Belessa upright on the couch. Tina grasped the windowsill, her face white.
"Listen, a howling far off, like many wolves." "Wolves?"
Belessa sprang up, fear clutching her heart.
"Wolves do not hunt in packs at this time of the year." "Oh, look!"
shrilled the girl, pointing.
"Men are running out of the forest."
In an instant, Belessa was beside her, staring wide-eyed at the figures, small in the distance, streaming out of the woods.
"The sailors!"
she gasped.
"Empty-handed! I see Zarono, Strom. Where is Conan?"
whispered the girl. Belessa shook her head.
"Listen! Oh, listen!"
whimpered the child, clinging to her.
"The Picts!"
All in the fort could hear it now, a vast ululation of mad exultation and bloodlust from the depths of the dark forest. That sound spurred on the panting men, reeling toward the palisade.
"Hasten!"
gasped Strom, his face a drawn mask of exhausted effort.
"They are almost at our heels. My ship—"
"She is too far for us to reach,"
panted Zarono.
"Make for the stockade. See, the men camped on the beach have seen us."
He waved his arms in breathless pantomime, but the men on the strand understood, and they recognized the significance of that wild howling, rising to a triumphant crescendo. The sailors abandoned their fires and cooking pots and fled for the stockade gate. They were pouring through it as the fugitives from the forest rounded the south angle and reeled into the gate, a heaving, frantic mob, half dead from exhaustion. The gate was slammed with frenzied haste, and sailors began to climb the firing ledge to join the men-at-arms already there. Belessa confronted Zarono.
"Where is Conan?"
The buccaneer jerked a thumb toward the blackening woods. His chest heaved, sweat poured down his face.
"Their scouts were at our heels before we gained the beach. He paused to slay a few and give us time to get away."
He staggered away to take his place on the firing ledge, whither Strom had already mounted. Valenzo stood there, a somber, cloak-wrapped figure, strangely silent and aloof. He was like a man bewitched.
"Look!"
yelped a pirate above the deafening howling of the yet unseen horde. A man emerged from the forest and raced fleetly across the open belt.
"Conan!"
Zarono grinned wolfishly.
"We're safe in the stockade. We know where the treasure is. No reason why we shouldn't feather him with arrows now."
"Nay!"
Strom caught his arm.
"We'll need his sword. Look!"
Behind the fleet-footed Cimmerian, a wild horde burst from the forest, howling as they ran. Naked Picts, hundreds and hundreds of them. Their arrows rained about the Cimmerian. A few strides more and Conan reached the eastern wall of the stockade, bounded high, seized the points of the logs, and heaved himself up and over, his cutlass in his teeth. Arrows thudded venomously into the logs where his body has just been. His resplendent coat was gone, his white silk shirt torn and blood-stained.
"Stop them!"
he roared as his feet hit the ground inside.
"If they get on the wall, we are done for!"
Pirates, buccaneers, and men-at-arms responded instantly, and a storm of arrows and quarrels tore into the oncoming horde. Conan saw Belessa with Tina clinging to her hand, and his language was picturesque.
"Get into the manor,"
he commanded in conclusion.
"Their shafts will arch over the wall. What did I tell you?"
As a black shaft cut into the earth at Belessa's feet and quivered like a serpent head, Conan caught up a long bow and leaped to the firing ledge.
"Some of you fellows prepare torches,"
he roared above the rising clamor of the battle.
"We can't fight them in the dark."
The sun had sunk in a welter of blood. Out in the bay the men aboard the carrack had cut the anchor chain, and the red hand was rapidly receding on the crimson horizon. Chapter 7 Men of the Woods. Night had fallen, but torches streamed across the strand, casting the mad scene into lurid revealment. Naked men in paint swarmed the beach. Like waves they came against the palisade, bare teeth and blazing eyes gleaming in the glare of the torches thrust over the wall. Toucan feathers waved in black manes, and the feathers of the cormorant and the sea falcon. A few warriors, the wildest and most barbaric of them all, wore sharks' teeth woven in their tangled locks. The sea-land tribes had gathered from up and down the coast in all directions to rid their country of the white-skinned invaders. They surged against the palisade, driving a storm of arrows before them, fighting into the teeth of the shafts and bolts that tore into their masses from the stockade. Sometimes they came so close to the wall they were hewing at the gate with their war axes and thrusting their spears through the loopholes. But each time the tide ebbed back without flowing over the palisade, leaving its drift of dead. At this kind of fighting, the freebooters of the sea were at their stoutest. Their arrows and bolts tore holes in the charging horde. Their cutlasses hewed the wild men from the palisades they strove to scale. Yet again and again the men of the woods returned to the onslaught with all the stubborn ferocity that had been roused in their fierce hearts.
"They are like mad dogs,"
gasped Zarono, hacking downward at the dark hands that grasped at the palisade points, the dark faces that snarled up at him.
"If we can hold the fort until dawn, they'll lose heart,"
grunted Conan, splitting a feathered skull with a professional precision.
"They won't maintain a long siege. Look, they're falling back."
The charge rolled back, and the men on the wall shook the sweat out of their eyes, counted their dead, and took a fresh grasp on the blood-slippery hilts of their swords. Like blood-hungry wolves, grudgingly driven from a cornered prey, the Picts skulked back beyond the ring of torches. Only the bodies of the slain lay before the palisade.
"Have they gone?"
Strum shook back his wet, tawny locks. The cutlass in his fist was notched and red. His brawny bare arm was splashed with blood.
"They're still out there."
Conan nodded toward the outer darkness which ringed the circle of torches, made more intense by their light. He glimpsed movements in the shadows, glitter of eyes and a dull sheen of steel.
"They've drawn off for a bit though,"
he said.
Put sentries on the wall and let the rest drink and eat. It's past midnight. We've been fighting for hours without much interval."
The chiefs clambered down from the ledges, calling their men from the walls. A sentry was posted in the middle of each wall, east, west, north and south, and a clump of men-at-arms were left at the gate. The Picts, to reach the wall, would have to charge across a wide, torch-lit space, and the defenders could resume their places long before the attackers could reach the palisade.
"Where's Valenso?"
demanded Conan, gnawing a huge beef bone as he stood beside a fire the men had built in the center of the compound. Pirates, buccaneers, and henchmen mingled with each other, wolfing the meat and ale the women brought them, and allowing their wounds to be bandaged.
"He disappeared an hour ago,"
grunted Strom.
"He was fighting on the wall beside me when suddenly he stopped short and glared out into the darkness as if he saw a ghost. 'Look,' he croaked, 'the black devil, I see him, out there in the night.' Well, I could swear I saw a figure moving among the shadows that was too tall for a Pict, but it was just a glimpse and it was gone. But Valenso jumped down from the firing ledge and staggered into the manor like a man with a mortal wound. I haven't seen him since."
"He probably saw the forest devil,"
said Conan tranquilly.
"The Picts say this ghost is lousy with them. What I'm more afraid of is fire arrows. The Picts are likely to start shooting them at any time. What's that? It sounded like a cry for help."
When the lull came in the fighting, Bellessa and Tina had crept to their window, from which they had been driven by the danger of flying arrows. Silently they watched the men gather about the fire.
"There are not enough men on the stockade,"
said Tina. In spite of her nausea at the sight of the corpses sprawled about the palisade, Bellessa was forced to laugh.
"Do you think you know more about wars and sieges than the freebooters?"
she chided gently.
"There should be more men on the walls,"
insisted the child, shivering.
"Suppose the black man came back."
Bellessa shuddered at the thought.
"I'm afraid,"
murmured Tina.
"I hope Strom and Zarano are killed." "And not Conan?"
asked Bellessa curiously.
"Conan would not harm us,"
said the child confidently.
"He lives up to his barbaric code of honor, but they are men who have lost all honor." "You are wise beyond your years, Tina,"
said Bellessa with a vague uneasiness the precocity of the girl frequently roused in her.
"Look!"
Tina stiffened.
"The sentry is gone from the south wall. I saw him on the ledge a moment ago. Now he has vanished."
From their window the palisade points of the south wall were just visible over the slanting roofs of a row of huts which paralleled that wall almost its entire length. A sort of open-topped corridor, 3 or 4 yards wide, was framed by the stockade and the back of the huts, which were built in a solid row. These huts were occupied by the serfs.
"Where could the sentry have gone?"
whispered Tina uneasily. Bellessa was watching one end of the hut row, which was not far from a side door of the manor. She could have sworn she saw a shadowy figure glide from behind the huts and disappear at the door. Was that the vanished sentry? Why had he left the wall, and why should he steal so subtly into the manor? She did not believe it was the sentry she had seen, and a nameless fear congealed her blood.
"Where is the Count, Tina?"
she asked.
"In the great hall, my lady. He sits alone at the table, wrapped in his cloak and drinking wine, with a face grey as death." "Go and tell him what we have seen. I will keep watch from this window, lest the Picts steal to the unguarded wall."
Tina scampered away. Bellessa heard her slippered feet pattering along the corridor, receding down the stair. Then, abruptly, terribly, there rang out a scream of such poignant fear that Bellessa's heart almost stopped with the shock of it. She was out of the chamber and flying down the corridor before she was aware that her limbs were in motion. She ran down the stair and halted as if turned to stone. She did not scream as Tina had screamed. She was incapable of sound or motion. She saw Tina, was aware of the reality of small hands grasping her frantically. But these were the only sane realities in a scene of black nightmare and lunacy and death, dominated by the monstrous anthropomorphic shadow which spread awful arms against a lurid hellfire glare. Out in the stockade, Strom shook his head at Conan's question.
I heard nothing.
I did.
Conan's wild instincts were roused. He was tensed, his eyes blazing.
It came from the south wall, behind those huts.
Drawing his cutlass, he strode toward the palisade. From the compound, the wall on the south and the sentry posted there were not visible, being hidden behind the huts. Strom followed, impressed by the Cimmerians' manner. At the mouth of the open space between the huts and wall, Conan halted warily. The space was dimly lighted by torches flaring at either corner of the stockade, and about midway of that natural corridor a crumpled shape sprawled on the ground.
Brachus!
Swore Strom, running forward and dropping on one knee beside the figure.
By Mitra, his throat's been cut from ear to ear.
Conan swept the space with a quick glance, finding it empty save for himself, Strom, and the dead man. He peered through a loophole. No living man moved within the ring of torchlight outside the fort.
Who could have done this?
He wondered.
Zarono!
Strom sprang up, spitting fury like a wildcat, his hair bristling, his face convulsed.
He has set his thieves to stabbing my man in the back. He plans to wipe me out by treachery. Devils, I am plagued within and without.
Wait.
Conan reached a restraining hand.
I don't believe Zarono.
But the maddened pirate jerked away and rushed around the end of the hut row, breathing blasphemies. Conan ran after him, swearing. Strom made straight toward the fire by which Zaronos' tall, lean form was visible as the buccaneer chief quaffed a jack of ale. His amazement was supreme when the jack was dashed violently from his hand, spattering his breastplate with foam, and he was jerked around to confront the passion-distorted face of the pirate captain.
"Ya murdering dog!"
roared Strom.
"Will you slay my men behind my back while they fight for your filthy hide as well as for mine?"
Conan was hurrying toward them, and on all sides men ceased eating and drinking to stare in amazement.
"What do you mean?"
sputtered Zarono.
"You have set your men to stabbing mine at their posts,"
screamed the maddened Barachan.
"You lie!"
Smoldering hate burst into sudden flame. With an incoherent howl, Strom heaved up his cutlass and cut at the buccaneer's head. Zarono caught a blow on his armored left arm, and sparks flew as he staggered back, ripping out his own sword. In an instant, the captains were fighting like madmen, their blades flaming and flashing in the firelight. Their crews reacted instantly and blindly. A deep roar went up as pirates and buccaneers drew their swords and fell upon each other. The men left on the walls abandoned their posts and leaped down into the stockade, blades in hand. In an instant, the compound was a battleground, where knotting, writhing groups of men smote and slew in a blind frenzy. Some of the men-at-arms and serfs were drawn into the melee, and the soldiers at the gate turned and stared down in amazement, forgetting the enemy which lurked outside. It had all happened so quickly, smoldering passions exploding into sudden battle, that men were fighting all over the compound before Conan could reach the maddened chiefs.
Ignoring their swords, he tore them apart with such violence that they staggered backward, and Zarono tripped and fell headlong.
"You cursed fools! Will you throw away all our lives?"
Strom was frothing mad, and Zarono was bowling for assistance. A buccaneer ran at Conan from behind and cut at his head. The Cimmerian half turned and caught his arm, checking the stroke in mid-air.
"Look, you fools!"
he roared, pointing with his sword. Something in his tone caught the attention of the battle-crazed mob. Men froze in their places with lifted swords, Zarono on one knee, and twisted their heads to stare. Conan was pointing at a soldier on the firing ledge. The man was reeling, arms clawing the air, choking as he tried to shout. Suddenly he pitched headlong to the ground, and all saw the black arrow standing up between his shoulders. A cry of alarm rose from the compound. On the heels of the shout came a clamor of blood-freezing screams, the shattering impact of axes on the gate. Flaming arrows arched over the wall and stuck in logs, and thin wisps of blue smoke curled upward. Then from behind the huts that ranged the south wall came swift and furtive figures racing across the compound.
"The Picts are in!"
roared Conan. Bedlam followed his shout. The freebooters ceased their feud. Some turned to meet the savages, some to spring to the wall. Savages were pouring from behind the huts, and they streamed over the compound. Their axes flashed against the cutlasses of the sailors. Zarono was struggling to his feet when a painted savage rushed upon him from behind and brained him with a war axe. Conan, with a clump of sailors behind him, was battling with the Picts inside the stockade, and Strom, with most of his men, was climbing up on the firing ledges, slashing at the dark figures already swarming over the wall. The Picts, who had crept up unobserved and surrounded the fort while the defenders were fighting among themselves, were attacking from all sides. Valensus' soldiers were clustered at the gate, trying to hold it against a howling swarm of exultant demons. More and more savages streamed from behind the huts, having scaled the undefended south wall. Strom and his pirates were beaten back from the other sides of the palisade, and in an instant the compound was swarming with naked warriors. They dragged down the defenders like wolves. The battle revolved into swirling whirlpools of painted figures, surging about small groups of desperate white men. Picts, sailors, and henchmen littered the earth, stamped underfoot by the heedless feet. Blood-smeared braves died howling into huts, and the shrieks that rose from the interiors where women and children died beneath the red axes rose above the din of the battle. The men-at-arms abandoned the gate when they heard those pitiful cries, and in an instant the Picts had burst it and were pouring into the palisade at that point also. Huts began to go up in flames.
"Make for the manor!"
roared Conan, and a dozen men surged in behind him as he hewed an inexorable way through the snarling pack. Strom was at his side, wielding his red cutlass like a flail.
"We can't hold the manor!"
grunted the pirate.
"Why not?"
Conan was too busy with his crimson work to spare a glance.
"Because,
A knife in a dark hand sank deep in the Barachan's back.
"Devil eat you, bastard!"
Strom turned staggeringly and split the savage's head to his teeth. The pirate reeled and fell to his knees, blood starting from his lips.
"The manor's burning!"
he croaked and slumped over in the dust. Conan cast a swift look about him. The men who had followed him were all down in their blood. The Pict
gasping out his life under the Cimmerian's feet, was the last of the group which had barred his way. All about him battle was swirling and surging, but for the moment he stood alone. He was not far from the south wall. A few strides and he could leap to the ledge, swing over and be gone through the night. But he remembered the helpless girls in the manor, from which now smoke was rolling in billowing masses. He ran toward the manor. A feathered chief wheeled from the door, lifting a war axe, and behind the racing Cimmerian, lines of fleet-footed braves were converging upon him. He did not check his stride. His downward sweeping cutlass met and deflected the axe and split the skull of its wielder. An instant later, Conan was through the door and had slammed and bolted it against the axes that splintered into the wood. The great hall was full of drifting wisps of smoke through which he groped, half blinded. Somewhere a woman was whimpering, little, catchy, hysterical sobs of nerve-shattering horror. He emerged from a whirl of smoke and stopped dead in his tracks, glaring down the hall. The hall was dim and shadowy with drifting smoke. The silver candelabrum was overturned, the candles extinguished. The only illumination was a lurid glow from the great fireplace and the wall in which it was set, where the flames licked from burning floor to smoking roof beams. And limned against that lurid glare, Conan saw a human form swinging slowly at the end of a rope. The dead face turned toward him as the body swung, and it was distorted beyond recognition. But Conan knew it was Count Valenzo, hanged to his own roof beam. But there was something else in the hall. Conan saw it through the drifting smoke, a monstrous black figure outlined against the hellfire glare. That outline was vaguely human, but the shadow thrown on the burning wall was not human at all. "Grum!" muttered Conan, aghast, paralyzed by the realization that he was confronted with a being against which his sword was helpless. He saw Bellessa and Tina clutched in each other's arms, crouching at the bottom of the stair. The black monster reared up, looming gigantic against the flame, great arms spread wide, a dim face leered through the drifting smoke, semi-human, demonic, altogether terrible. Conan glimpsed the close-set horns, the gaping mouth, the peaked ears. It was lumbering toward him through the smoke, and an old memory woke with desperation. Near the Cimmerian stood a massive silver bench, ornately carven, once part of the splendor of Corzetta Castle. Conan grasped it, heaved it high above his head. "Silver and fire!" he roared in a voice like a clap of wind, and hurled the bench with all the power of his iron muscles. Full on the great black breast it crashed, 100 pounds of silver winged with terrific velocity. Not even the Black One could stand before such a missile. He was carried off his feet, hurtled backward headlong into the open fireplace, which was a roaring mouth of flame. A horrible scream shook the hall, the cry of an unearthly thing gripped suddenly by earthly death. The mantel cracked and stones fell from the great chimney, half hiding the black writhing limbs at which the flames were eating in elemental fury. Burning beams crashed down from the roof and thundered on the stones, and the whole heap was enveloped by a roaring burst of fire. Flames were racing down the stair when Conan reached it. He caught up the fainting child under one arm and dragged Bellessa to her feet. Through the crackle and snap of the fire sounded the splintering of the door under the war axes. He glared about, sighted a door opposite the stair landing, and hurried through it, carrying Tina and half-dragging Bellessa, who seemed dazed. As they came into the chamber beyond, a reverberation behind them announced that the roof was falling in the hall. Through a strangling wall of smoke, Conan saw an open outer door on the other side of the chamber. As he lugged his charges through it, he saw it sagged on broken hinges. Lock and bolt snapped and splintered as if by some terrific force.
"The black man came in by this door,"
Bellessa sobbed hysterically.
"I saw him, but I did not know."
They emerged into the fire-lit compound, a few feet from the hut row that lined the south wall. A Pict was skulking toward the door, eyes red in the firelight, axe lifted. Turning the girl on his arm away from the blow, Conan drove his cutlass through the savage's breast, and then, sweeping Bellessa off her feet, ran toward the south wall, carrying both girls. The compound was full of billowing smoke clouds that hid half the red work going on there, but the fugitives had been seen. Naked figures, black against the dull glare, pranced out of the smoke, brandishing gleaming axes. They were still yards behind them when Conan ducked into the spaces between the huts and the wall. At the other end of the corridor, he saw other howling shapes running to cut him off. Halting short, he tossed Bellessa bodily to the firing ledge and leaped after her. Swinging her over the palisade, he dropped her into the sand outside and dropped Tina after her. A thrown axe crashed into a log by his shoulder, and then he too was over the wall and gathering up his dazed and helpless charges. When the Picts reached the wall, the space before the palisade was empty of all except the dead. Chapter 8. A pirate returns to the sea. Dawn was tinging the dim waters with an old rose hue. Far out across the tinted waters, a fleck of white grew out of the mist, a sail that seemed to hang suspended in the pearly sky. On a bushy headland, Conan the Cimmerian held a ragged cloak over a fire of green wood. As he manipulated the cloak, puffs of smoke rose upward, quivered against the dawn and vanished. Bellessa crouched near him, one arm about Tina.
"Do you think they'll see it and understand?"
"They'll see it right enough,"
he assured her.
"They've been hanging off and on this coast all night, hoping to sight some survivors. They're scared stiff. There's only half a dozen of them, and not one can navigate well enough to sail from here to the Barachan Isles. They'll understand my signals. It's the pirate code. I'm telling them that the captains are dead and all the sailors, and for them to come inshore and take us aboard. They know I can navigate, and they'll be glad to ship under me. They'll have to. I'm the only captain left."
"But suppose the Picts see the smoke?"
She shuddered, glancing back over the misty sands and bushes to where, miles to the north, a column of smoke stood up in the still air.
"They are not likely to see it. After I hid you in the woods, I crept back and saw them dragging barrels of wine and ale out of the storehouse. Already most of them were reeling. They'll all be lying around, too drunk to move by this time. If I had 100 men, I could wipe out the whole horde. Look, there goes a rocket from the Red Hand. That means they're coming to take us off."
Conan stamped out the fire, handed the cloak back to Bellessa, and stretched like a great lazy cat. Bellessa watched him in wonder. His unperturbed manner was not assumed. the night of fire and blood and slaughter, and the flight through the black woods afterward had left his nerves untouched. He was as calm as if he had spent the night in feast and revel. Belessa did not fear him. She felt safer than she had felt since she landed on that wild coast. He was not like the freebooters, civilized men who had repudiated all standards of honor and lived without any. Conan, on the other hand, lived according to the code of his people, which was barbaric and bloody, but at least upheld its own peculiar standards of honor. "Do you think he is dead?" she asked without seeming irrelevancy. He did not ask her to whom she referred.
I believe so. Silver and fire are both deadly to evil spirits, and he got a belly full of both.
Neither spoke of that subject again. Belessa's mind shrank from the task of conjuring up the scene when a black figure skulked into the great hall and a long-delayed vengeance was horribly consummated.
What will you do when you get back to Zingara?
Conan asked. She shook her head helplessly.
"I do not know. I have neither money nor friends. I am not trained to earn my living. Perhaps it would have been better had one of those arrows struck my heart." "Do not say that, my lady,"
begged Tina.
"I will work for us both."
Conan drew a small leather bag from inside his girdle.
I didn't get Dot McCree's jewels, he rumbled, but here are some baubles I found in the chest where I got the clothes I'm wearing.
He spilled a handful of flaming rubies into his palm.
They are worth a fortune themselves.
He dumped them back into the bag and handed it to her.
"But I can't take these,"
she began.
Of course you'll take them. I might as well leave you for the Picts to scalp as to take you back to Zingara to starve, said he. I know what it is to be penniless in a Hyborian land. Now in my country, sometimes there are famines, but people are hungry only when there's no food in the land at all. But in civilized countries, I've seen people sick of gluttony while others were starving. I've seen men fall and die of hunger against the walls of shops and storehouses crammed with food. Sometimes I was hungry too, but then I took what I wanted at sword's point. But you can't do that. So you take these rubies. You can sell them and buy a castle and slaves and fine clothes. And with them it won't be hard to get a husband, because civilized men all desire wives with these possessions.
"But what of you?"
Conan grinned and indicated the red hand drawing swiftly inshore.
A ship and a crew are all I want. As soon as I set foot on that deck, I'll have a ship, and as soon as I can raise the parachans, I'll have a crew. The lads of the Red Brotherhood are eager to ship with me, because I always lead them to rare loot. And as soon as I've set you and the girl ashore on the Zigaran coast, I'll show the dogs some looting. Nay, no thanks. What are a handful of gems to me, when all the loot of the southern seas will be mine for the grasping?